is thrown into a river and left for dead. He wakes up somewhere that isn't the world he knew. And what begins as a story about revenge and a broken clan becomes something much larger. A story about two worlds, an ancient mystery, and the cost of rebuilding something that was taken from you. This is Midnight Law. Tonight, we tell the entire Crimson Desert story, slowly, from the very beginning. If this is your first time here, the channel has more Fallout, StarCraft, Dead Space, Heroes of Might and Magic, and more. All told the same way. Subscribe and let the next story find you. Now, let's go back to Pywel.
Get comfortable. Let everything slow down around you. This story begins on a continent that has known almost nothing but conflict. A land of 5 distinct regions, each with its own landscape and its own people, and its own particular brand of violence. A land where kings rise and fall, where merchants hold as much power as lords, where the roads between cities are dangerous enough that entire industries have grown up around the business of protection. A land called Pywel. Pywel is not a gentle place. It is beautiful in the way that many dangerous things are beautiful. Sweeping landscapes of forest and mountain and coastal plain, ancient ruins embedded in the hillsides like old wounds that never quite healed, cities that smell of smoke and spice, and the particular kind of human density that comes from too many people living too close together in too uncertain a world. It is the kind of place that produces a certain type of person, someone who has learned from an early age that safety is temporary, that comfort is a luxury, that the world will take from you if you let it. The people of Pywel have adapted to this reality in various ways. Some of them have built institutions, kingdoms, merchant guilds, religious orders, designed to impose some structure on the chaos. Some of them have retreated to the margins, to the places where the long arm of organized power does not quite reach. And some of them have done what humans in difficult circumstances have always done, across every culture in every world that has ever produced this particular problem. They became mercenaries. Mercenaries are not a new invention on Pywel. They have existed as long as there have been people who needed things done, and other people willing to do those things for money. But in the period of Crimson Desert story, the mercenary tradition has reached a particular flowering. The political situation on the continent, which we will get to in time, has created conditions in which mercenary companies are not simply useful, but essential. The kingdoms and factions that compete for power on Pywel have found that maintaining standing armies is expensive and politically complicated, while hiring mercenaries is cheaper, more flexible, and allows a degree of plausible deniability that permanent military forces do not. The result is an ecosystem of mercenary companies ranging from small groups of desperate fighters barely scraping by, to large, well-organized outfits with established reputations, regular clients, and the kind of institutional weight that comes from decades of reliable service. Some of these companies have become so central to the political economy of Pywel that they function almost as a third kind of power alongside the kingdoms and the guilds, not governing exactly, but shaping events in ways that the officially powerful have learned to account for. Into this world, we are introduced to the Greymanes, The Greymanes are not the largest mercenary company on Pywel, and they are not the most famous. But they have something that many larger operations lack: a genuine sense of internal loyalty, a coherent identity, a way of understanding themselves that goes beyond simply doing violence for whoever will pay for it. They are a clan as much as a company. Their social structure has echoes of something older. The warrior societies of communities that have been fighting for survival long enough that fighting has become not just a profession, but a way of life, a code, an identity. Their homeland is a place called Pailune. It is a pastoral region, the kind of landscape that the word homeland was invented for. Green hills and clear water, and the kind of air that smells like something worth protecting. The Greymanes have been there for generations. The land is part of who they are, in the way that places become part of people when families have lived in them long enough. At the head of the Greymanes is a man named Martinus. He is the kind of leader that mercenary companies produce in their best moments. Someone who has kept a group of people alive through conditions that would have scattered a less cohesive organization. Who has built something real from the raw material of conflict and hardship. He is respected. He is trusted. He has sons. One of those sons is named Kliff. Kliff MacDuff is the person whose story we are going to follow. He is a warrior, trained from childhood in the tradition of the Greymanes, capable and disciplined and loyal in the specific way that people are loyal when their identity is completely bound up with the organization they belong to. He is his father's son, which means he carries the weight of expectation that comes with that position, the particular pressure of being the heir to something that other people have built and that you are supposed to maintain. He is not a simple person, though the world he inhabits will try to reduce him to simple categories. He is morally grounded in ways that the mercenary life does not always accommodate. He cares about the people around him in ways that extend beyond their usefulness to him or to the company. He is the kind of person who, in a different kind of story, might be the foundation of something new, something built on different principles than the ones that currently govern Pywel. But Kliff's story does not begin in a moment of foundation. It begins in a moment of destruction. Pywel has 5 distinct regions, each of which will matter to the story we are telling. The first is the coastal lowlands, fertile, well-watered, home to the major trading cities that drive the continent's economy. This is where the Goldleaf Merchant Guild has its greatest presence, where commerce and politics are most tightly intertwined, where the wealth that everyone else on the continent is ultimately fighting over is generated and accumulated. The second region is the interior highlands, rougher terrain, colder climate, less hospitable but rich in minerals and timber. This is where many of the mercenary companies have their traditional bases of operation, where the landscape itself has shaped a harder kind of culture. Pailune, the Greymane's homeland, is here. The third region is the southern forests, ancient and dense, full of things that have been in those trees long enough to have developed their own relationships with the land that human civilization does not fully understand. The forests of Pywel are not empty. They are not simply scenery. They contain things that the people of the cities and the highlands have largely learned to leave alone, because the things in the forests have demonstrated repeatedly that they do not need to be approached first. The fourth region is the eastern reaches, arid, dramatic, geologically active in ways that make settlement difficult and travel dangerous, but that have also produced landscapes of extraordinary visual power. The eastern reaches are where Pywel's history is most physically visible. The ruins here are older and more extensive than anywhere else on the continent, and the things that were built in those ruins and the reasons they were built are questions that scholars and adventurers have been arguing about for generations. The fifth region is the Northern Territory. Cold, sparsely populated, strategically important because of its position relative to the other four regions and the trade routes that connect them. The Northern Territory is contested in a way that the other regions are not, because controlling it means controlling access to significant portions of Pywel's internal commerce. These 5 regions are not isolated from each other. They are connected by roads and rivers and the networks of trade and communication that any functioning continent develops over time. But they are distinct enough that each has its own character, its own power structures, its own way of relating to the rest of the world. Understanding Pywel means understanding not just the continent as a whole, but each of these regions in their particularity. Now, before we get to what happened to the Greymanes, we need to understand the political situation that made what happened possible. Pywel is not a unified political entity. It has never been a unified political entity, despite the efforts of various rulers across various centuries to make it one. What it has, instead, is a complex and always shifting balance of power between a number of competing forces. Kingdoms, merchant guilds, mercenary companies, and the various other organizations that have carved out space for themselves in the continent's political ecology. The kingdoms of Pywel are the most traditional form of power on the continent. They have territories, laws, armies, and all the other apparatus of organized governance. But they are not stable in the way that their official ceremonies and symbols suggest. Succession is contested. Alliances shift. Kingdoms that were powerful a generation ago can find themselves reduced in just a few decades by a combination of poor leadership, military defeat, and the kind of internal division that tends to emerge whenever a strong ruler is replaced by a weaker one. In the period of Crimson Desert story, one of the central political facts of Pywel is that a king has fallen into a coma. This single event, which might in a more stable political environment have been managed through the normal mechanisms of succession, has instead triggered exactly the kind of power vacuum that the most ambitious and the most dangerous people on the continent had been waiting for. Multiple factions have moved to fill the space left by the incapacitated king. Multiple claimants have emerged, and the complex web of alliances and dependencies that had kept the continent in something approximating equilibrium has been disrupted in ways that are still playing out. Into this disrupted equilibrium, the mercenary companies have moved. They always do. Political instability is, from a purely economic perspective, good for business in the short term. There are more people who need things done, more clients willing to pay, more contracts available. The danger for mercenary companies comes from the fact that political instability is also unpredictable in ways that make it easy to end up on the wrong side of conflicts that you thought you understood. The Greymanes had a position in this landscape. They had clients, relationships, a reputation built over years of reliable service. They had a homeland in Pailune that gave them a base of operations and a stake in the stability of their region. They had the particular kind of institutional confidence that comes from having survived long enough to start thinking of survival as the expected outcome. They were wrong to feel confident. The Black Bears were watching, and the Black Bears had decided that the moment had come. The Black Bears are the Greymanes' rivals. They're direct competitors for territory, clients, and the particular kind of status that mercenary companies accumulate in places like the interior highlands of Pywel. The enmity between the two organizations is old enough to have taken on the character of tradition. They had competed, clashed, and occasionally fought in the way that rival organizations in close proximity always eventually fight. but the fighting had always been bounded, governed by the implicit rules that keep competition from becoming annihilation. The understanding that both sides have more to gain from the other's existence as a competitor than from their complete destruction. Mercenaries changed that calculation. Mercenaries is the leader of the Black Bears, and he is not interested in bounded competition. He is not interested in the implicit rules. He is a man who has looked at the political situation on Pywel, the king in a coma, the factions scrambling, the old order dissolving, and seen an opportunity that will not last. He has decided to use that opportunity not simply to improve his position, but to eliminate his primary competition entirely. The attack, when it comes, is not a battle. It is a massacre. The Greymanes do not see it coming with enough warning to prepare a proper defense. Their homeland in Pailune is overwhelmed. Many of them are killed. Those who survived the initial attack are scattered, driven away from Pailune, separated from each other, forced into the kind of desperate individual survival that no one is well prepared for when they have spent their entire lives in the context of a functioning community. And Kliff is among the last defenders. He fights until he cannot fight anymore. And then Mercenaries himself, the bearskin-wearing leader of the Black Bears, enormous and brutal and utterly confident, finds him. Kliff is killed, or something very much like killed. And then something happens that changes everything about the story we thought we were going to be told. He wakes up somewhere else, somewhere that is not Pywel at all. In the next part, we explore what that somewhere else is. We talk about the Abyss, the other dimension that Kliff finds himself in after his death, the strange and ancient place that gives him something he should not have, and sends him back to Pywel as something different from what he was before. Rest now. The story is only beginning. Welcome back. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. In the last part, we watched the Greymanes fall. We watched Pailune, their homeland, overwhelmed by the Black Bears and their leader Mercenaries. We watched Kliff fight until he could not fight anymore. And then we watched Mercenaries find him. We watched what happened next, the violence of it, the finality of it. And we arrived at a moment that should have been an ending. It was not an ending. Kliff did not die in the way that death usually works. He was thrown into a river during the chaos of the attack, injured, unconscious, presumed dead by the surviving Greymanes, who scattered in the aftermath and had no reason to believe anyone could have survived what Kliff went through. The river took him. The current carried him away from Pailune, away from the ruin of everything he had known, into the dark. And then the dark became something else. The place Kliff woke up in is called the Abyss, and it is not a place that can be adequately described by simply listing its features. It exists above Pywel, high in the clouds, or perhaps somewhere beyond the clouds, in a dimension that runs parallel to the physical world without quite being part of it. From the floating islands of the Abyss, you can look down and see Pywel spread out below you. The fields and forests and cities, visible in extraordinary detail, somehow close and impossibly distant at the same time. The Abyss is ancient. Its structures, the floating ruins, the strange architecture of the places that exist there, predate anything on Pywel's surface. They were built by hands that are not immediately identifiable as human, using techniques that no living craftsperson on the continent could replicate. The geometry of the Abyss is wrong in ways that take time to adjust to. Spaces that should be small contain unexpected depths. Heights that should be terrifying feel navigable in ways they shouldn't. The rules of the physical world apply here, but they apply imprecisely, as though the Abyss is a place where the same underlying reality that governs Pywel expresses itself differently. The specific location where Kliff first finds himself is a place called the Wycliffe Mappery. It is a structure of remarkable strangeness. Alien architecture unlike anything on the surface, with a quality that suggests both great age and a kind of functional intent, as though it was built for a purpose that it is still, in some sense, carrying out. The Mappery is a place of knowledge, or was once. Its walls and surfaces contain records of things that no one on Pywel currently knows or remembers. Kliff wakes here and does what a man in his situation would do. He moves. He does not understand where he is. He does not have enough information to make sense of what he is experiencing. But he is alive. He is functional enough to move. And there is something at the end of the path ahead of him that is worth reaching. This is what the Greymanes have always done, what the mercenary life has trained into him. When you do not know what is happening, you assess what you can do, and you do it. Analysis is for later. Movement is for now. What Kliff finds in the abyss, beyond the initial disorientation, is something that changes the fundamental nature of what he is capable of. The abyss contains fragments, pieces of itself, or pieces of whatever the abyss is a container for, distributed across both the floating islands above and the surface of Pywel below. These fragments, called abyss artifacts, are not simply objects. They are concentrations of something, power, or information, or potential, or all three simultaneously in ways that the people of Pywel have not yet developed language to distinguish. When a person interacts with an abyss artifact, when they absorb its energy and learn to work with it, they become capable of things they could not do before. Kliff's time in the abyss gives him a set of these capabilities. The blinding flash, a technique that reflects light with devastating precision, capable of disorienting enemies and opening pathways that would otherwise be inaccessible. The axiom force, an enhancement of his physical capability that goes beyond what training alone could produce, something that makes him faster and more powerful in ways that border on the supernatural. The ability to glide, to move through air in ways that no unaugmented human body can manage. Combat techniques that he learns not from a teacher, but from watching, from observing enemies and allies and simply understanding at some level that the abyss has opened up in him, what they are doing, and how he could do it too. These are not magical powers in the traditional sense. The abyss is not magic, or rather, what looks like magic from the perspective of Pywel's surface is something more specific, more grounded in a kind of mechanics that the abyss seems to operate by. The fragments function as a technology of sorts, even if it is a technology so far outside the normal frame of reference for anyone on the continent that the distinction between technology and magic is practically meaningless. What matters for Kliff's immediate situation is this: he went into the abyss a skilled mercenary, a trained swordsman, a capable warrior in the normal range of human combat. He comes out of the abyss something considerably more dangerous. He also comes out with questions that he does not yet have answers to. The abyss is not explained to him. No figure of authority appears and tells him what this place is, why he ended up here, what he is supposed to do with what he has gained. The Wycliffe Mappery suggests, by its existence, that the abyss has a history and a purpose. The structures of the floating islands suggest that someone built them, and that someone had reasons for building them. But those reasons are not immediately apparent, and Kliff's more pressing concern is not cosmic understanding, but survival and purpose. He has a reason to return to Pywel. He has several reasons actually, and they are arranged in a hierarchy that is clarifying as he moves through the abyss and begins to understand that returning to the physical world is possible. The Greymanes are scattered. his comrades, Unka, Jan, Naira, and the others who survived the attack on Pailune, are somewhere on the continent, separated from each other, in various states of difficulty and danger. Finding them, reuniting with them, and rebuilding what was broken is the first and most fundamental goal. This is the duty that the Greymane tradition demands, the thing that being a Greymane actually means when everything external has been stripped away. Beyond that, there is Mirrodin, the man who led the attack, the man who is personally responsible for what happened to Pailune, to Martinus, to every Greymane who did not survive the night of the ambush. Kliff is not a person who thinks primarily in terms of revenge. He is more oriented toward duty and restoration than toward pure vengeance. But Mirrodin is not simply a personal enemy. He is an ongoing threat. As long as Mirrodin leads the Black Bears, the scattered Greymanes are in danger, and the possibility of rebuilding anything meaningful is constrained by the knowledge that the people who destroyed what was built before are still in a position to destroy it again. And then there is something else, something that Kliff does not yet fully understand, but that the Abyss has begun to make him aware of, a larger problem. A threat that is not about the Greymanes specifically, not about the political situation on Pywel specifically, but about something older and more fundamental than either. The Abyss is not stable. Its balance has been disrupted. Fragments are falling from the floating islands to pile below, warping the land wherever they land, attracting exactly the kind of people that concentrated power tends to attract: the ambitious, the desperate, and the malicious. The Black Bears, it turns out, are not simply a mercenary company with a grudge against the Greymanes. They are among the factions that have been collecting and using Abyss artifacts, which explains some of what Mirrodin is capable of, and some of why the attack on Pailune succeeded as thoroughly as it did. The fragments falling from the Abyss are, in a sense, the symptom of a larger problem. Something above and beyond the political conflicts of Pywel's surface is creating an imbalance that the surface cannot long sustain. The person who was supposed to be responsible for addressing this, whose duty it was to watch over the relationship between the Abyss and the physical world, to keep the balance from deteriorating past the point of recovery, was Jian, the former leader of the Greymanes, a man whose significance, as Kliff will learn, extended far beyond his role as head of a mercenary company. Jian is dead. He was killed in the events that set the current crisis in motion, and with his death, the responsibility he carried, the duty that was somehow bound up with his role among the Greymanes, has been left unmet. The Abyss continues to destabilize, the fragments continue to fall, and the forces that benefit from that instability continue to grow stronger. Kliff does not yet understand all of this, but the Abyss has given him enough to understand that his return to Pywel will involve more than he anticipated. The personal mission: find the Greymanes, rebuild what was lost, confront Mirrodin, is real and urgent. But it exists within a larger context that is going to demand more from him than any single personal mission would. He steps through the final passage of the Wycliffe Mappery. A cutscene pulls him back. He finds himself at the side of a river, alive and changed, on the surface of Pywel. A man named Sebastian calls out to him. Simple words, ordinary human contact, the texture of a world that continues to function in small ways, even when large things have broken. Kliff is back. The road to Hernand is the first section of what will become a much longer journey. Hernand is a city, a trading hub, the kind of place that accumulates people because it sits at the intersection of routes that other people need to travel. It has the particular quality of cities that exist for practical reasons rather than symbolic ones. Functional, densely inhabited, aware of itself as a place where things happen, because enough different kinds of people pass through it. For Kliff, Hernand is the first base of operations after the catastrophe of Pailune. It is where he will begin the work of rebuilding, not the physical place that was lost, not Pailune itself, but the community, the organization, the thing that made the Greymanes, rather than simply a collection of individuals. You can lose a homeland and still be what you were. The Greymane's identity was never primarily geographical. It was about the people and the bonds between them, and those, while scattered, are not gone. The first days in Hernand are not what Kliff would have designed for himself. There are ordinary tasks, the kind of work that any person newly arrived in a city needs to do to establish themselves, to build enough trust with the people around them to be given access to the things they actually need. A chimney to clean, a dispute to resolve, favors to extend and receive, the mundane apparatus of social integration, which does not pause for personal catastrophe and does not care about the scale of what Kliff has just been through. This is one of the things that the world of Pywel does consistently. It refuses to suspend itself in deference to its protagonists. The people of Hernand have their own concerns, their own needs, their own version of the political and economic situation that they are navigating as best they can. Kliff's arrival is notable to him. To them, it is one more new person coming to the city. Eventually, these small interactions accumulate into something more significant. Kliff's actions in Hernand draw the attention of Shakatu, the head of the Goldleaf Merchant Guild's operations in the region. The Goldleaf Guild is one of the major power structures on Pywel, a commercial organization with the resources and reach of a minor kingdom, whose influence extends through the continent's economy in ways that are sometimes more decisive than military force. Shakatu is a pragmatic man in the way that successful merchants tend to be. He is interested in what things can do and what they cost, and he has learned to identify capability when he encounters it. He has a problem that Kliff's particular capabilities might solve. The problem has a name: Kylock the Hornsplitter, a figure who has taken control of a portion of the guild's operations by force, using the kind of direct violence that mercenary experience provides in abundance. Shakatu cannot simply ignore Kylock. The man's presence is damaging the guild's business and its reputation, and the methods available to a commercial organization for dealing with someone who has decided to operate outside commercial norms are limited. What Shakatu needs is someone who can operate outside those norms themselves. He asks Kliff. Kliff, who needs allies, who needs resources, who needs the kind of political cover that a connection to the Goldleaf Guild can provide, agrees. This is how mercenary relationships work. Mutual need creates mutual accommodation. Neither party is doing the other a pure favor. Both are making a calculation. The resolution of the Kylock problem gives Kliff something beyond the immediate practical benefits. It gives him a reputation in Hernand, a visible demonstration that he is not simply a refugee from a destroyed mercenary company, but an active agent in the world, capable of handling problems that other people cannot. And reputation, in the environment of Pywel, is the currency on which everything else depends. With the support of Shakatu and the attention of Marquis Circus, a local noble whose interests and the guild's interests overlap in complicated ways, Kliff is able to establish what will become the new Greymane camp. Not in Pailune, not in their homeland, but here in Hernand, on the territory of people who have reasons to want the Greymanes functional. The camp is small at first. Kliff and whatever companions have found their way to him. the beginning of the structure that will eventually become, if everything goes as it needs to, something worth calling the Greymanes again. This is where Kliff's story settles into its rhythm. Two simultaneous missions running in parallel, each feeding into the other. The search for the scattered Greymanes and the engagement with the political and supernatural situation on Pywel that keeps revealing itself to be larger and more dangerous than the immediate problems suggest. In the next part, we begin to follow both of those threads more closely. We meet the companions who will define Kliff's journey. We go deeper into the politics of Pywel, into House Celeste, into the struggle for the throne, into the specific human beings who are using the power vacuum created by the king's coma to advance agendas that range from merely ambitious to genuinely destructive. And we begin to understand what the Abyss is doing to Pywel's surface in ways that cannot be ignored. Sleep well, Kliff is back. The work is just beginning. Welcome back. Let the world outside go quiet. We are in Hernand now. Kliff has established the beginnings of what will become the new Greymane camp, a small foothold in unfamiliar territory, dependent on the goodwill of people who have their own reasons for extending that goodwill and who will withdraw it if those reasons stop being satisfied. This is the nature of the position Kliff finds himself in. Not an outsider asking for charity, but a capable person offering capability in exchange for the space to rebuild. The distinction matters. It shapes everything about how the early chapters of his story unfold. But Kliff cannot do what needs to be done alone. The Greymanes were never a one-person organization, and rebuilding them as one would be a contradiction in terms. What makes the Greymanes is the web of relationships between people. The mutual knowledge, the accumulated trust, the particular chemistry of a group that has been through enough together to know what each person can be counted on for. That web was torn apart by the attack on Pailune. The work of the story's middle sections is the work of reweaving it. The scattered Greymanes are across Pywel. Some of them are in Hernand's surrounding territory. Others have travelled further, drawn by necessity or by the specific situations they found themselves in after the ambush scattered them. Finding them means travelling. Travelling means encountering the full complexity of the continent that Pywel actually is, rather than the relatively contained world of Pailune and its immediate surroundings that was the Greymane's previous frame of reference. Unka is the most immediately recognizable of the Greymanes who will rejoin Kliff's circle. He is enormous, described consistently as having a warrior's build taken to an extreme, the kind of physical presence that makes crowds part instinctively. He wields a massive axe with the easy familiarity of someone who has been carrying something similar his whole life, and his combat style reflects his physique. He does not move with the speed and precision of Kliff's swordsmanship, but the things he hits with the axe tend to stay hit. Unka is not simply a blunt instrument, however. His characterization in the game consistently emphasizes a philosophical dimension that sits in interesting contrast with his physical capabilities. A man who thinks carefully about the things he does and the world he does them in, who brings a reflective quality to situations that are usually addressed through action. He is a warrior because that is what his origins and his circumstances have made him. But he is also a person who has considered the meaning of being a warrior with more care than most warriors bother to. He is of orc lineage, raised among warriors, formed by a tradition that values direct strength and directness of purpose. His reunion with Kliff, when it comes, is not a sentimental moment. These are not people who express their relationships through sentiment, but the reunion has weight precisely because the relationship it restores is one that was defined by reliability, by the specific confidence that comes from having fought alongside someone and knowing, without needing to think about it, what they will do in any given moment. Unka is the last of the 3 playable characters to be unlocked. His reintegration into the Greymanes comes later in the story, at a point where the stakes have escalated beyond the personal and regional into something that demands every available resource. His contribution, when it finally comes, reflects the full development of what Kliff has been building toward. Demeniss is a different kind of addition to Kliff's circle. She is not a Greymane, not a member of the original group whose loss and recovery is the story's structural spine. She is someone who comes from outside that circle, who joins it for reasons that are her own, rather than reasons that belong to the Greymane's institutional history. She comes from Demeniss. Demeniss is one of the 5 regions of Pywel, the largest and politically most significant, home to the kingdom whose comatose king created the power vacuum that set the entire crisis in motion. It is a place of old institutions and complicated history, where the presence of established noble houses like House Celeste shapes daily life in ways that the more independent culture of the Highland mercenary world does not. Damien's past in Demeniss is marked by loss. Her family was destroyed. The specific circumstances of that destruction involve the erasure of records, the kind of deliberate obliteration of identity that powerful people sometimes practice when they want to eliminate a problem without the complications of outright visible violence. After her family's destruction, she was taken in by a swordmaster who recognized her capabilities and trained her in combat. She developed into what the game's description calls a speedy combatant, someone whose fighting style is built around precision and speed rather than strength, who uses a rapier with a mastery that reflects years of disciplined practice, who can combine close-range swordsmanship with a pistol and musket at range in ways that make her uniquely versatile. When her swordmaster disappeared under circumstances that she could not fully explain or resolve, Demeniss fled Demeniss. She arrived in Hernand with nothing. No institutional backing, no established relationships, no particular plan beyond the immediate need to be somewhere other than where she had been. The Greymanes offered her something. Not charity, not pity, but a context in which her capabilities were valued and her past did not need to be the defining fact about her. She joins not because she owes the Greymanes something, but because what they are aligns with what she is. People who have lost things and are trying to build something in the absence of those things. People whose identity is formed by loyalty to each other, rather than by the institutions and bloodlines that Demeniss's world runs on. Her characterization as a person is defined by what her voice actor describes as a down-to-earth fierceness. Grounded, clear-eyed, not given to self-pity or excessive sentiment, but possessed of a strong sense of justice that can override her pragmatism when it encounters something sufficiently wrong. She and Kliff are not identical personalities, but they are compatible ones, both formed by loss, both oriented toward action rather than complaint, both capable of the kind of focus that difficult situations demand. She is unlocked as a playable character after the establishment of the Greymane camp at Howling Hill, one of the early chapter's major achievements, and from that point serves as both a member of the expanded party and a window into aspects of Pywel's world that Kliff's particular history and perspective would not naturally access. Now, beyond the companions who will define Kliff's journey, the world of Pywel itself demands attention, because understanding what Kliff is navigating, the political terrain, the competing factions, the specific human agendas that shape what is possible, and what is dangerous, is essential to understanding the story. Pywel has, by some counts, over 100 distinct factions operating across its 5 regions. Most of these are relatively minor, local organizations whose influence does not extend beyond their immediate area, whose significance to the story is contextual rather than central. But several of them are major players whose actions and relationships with each other define the larger shape of what the continent is going through. House Celeste is the noble house that controls Hernand, or controls the access to Hernand Castle, which amounts to much the same thing in a world where physical fortifications translate directly into political authority. House Celeste is one of the factions that Kliff has to build a relationship with in order to establish himself in the region. They begin from a position of neutral assessment, not hostile, but not welcoming. They have their own concerns, their own politics, their own reading of the situation on Pywel, and Kliff's arrival represents both a potential asset and a potential complication. House Celeste's territory around Hernand has been seized in parts by a minor warlord named Greymane. This is one of the specific expressions of the larger political instability. The comatose king's absence from power has created an environment in which people like Greymane, who have enough local force to seize things, do so. Addressing this situation is part of how Kliff builds his reputation in the region and his relationship with House Celeste. The Goldleaf Merchant Guild, which we have already mentioned in connection with Shakatu and the Kylok problem, is present throughout Hernand and beyond. The guild structure is essentially continental in scope. It is not a single organization with a single hierarchy, so much as a network of regional operations that share a name and a basic commercial orientation, while operating with considerable local autonomy. This structure makes it adaptable. It can absorb disruptions in one region without the whole network collapsing. But it also means that each branch is somewhat independent, and what is good for the network as a whole is not always what individual branch operators prioritize. The relationship between the Goldleaf Guild and the Greymanes, established through the Kylok situation, is a commercial relationship with political dimensions. The guild has information, extensive networks of intelligence about what is happening across Pywel, because commercial networks and intelligence networks overlap substantially in any world, where knowing things first is a competitive advantage. They have resources. They have relationships with other factions that the Greymanes, in their current diminished state, do not have access to. And Shakatu, who now leads the Hernand branch, has decided that aligning with Kliff's project is worth the investment. The Wolf Trackers are among the hostile factions that Kliff and his allies have to deal with in the Hernand region. They are one of the rogue groups that operate outside the formal power structures. Bands of fighters pursuing their own agendas in territory that the established factions consider theirs. The conflict between House Celeste and the Wolf Trackers is one of the regional tensions that Kliff becomes involved in as a consequence of operating in Hernand. And underlying all of this, the noble houses, the merchant guilds, the mercenary companies, the rogue groups, is the larger political crisis. The king of Demeniss is in a coma. Nobody with authority has said clearly what happens next. The institutions of governance that normally determine succession are all in some sense suspended, because the crisis is too unusual for any existing procedure to handle cleanly. And into that suspended moment, every faction with ambitions has inserted itself, pursuing its own version of what the next Pywel should look like. Some of these factions want stability, the return of something like the order that existed before the king fell. These are typically the factions with the most to lose from prolonged chaos, the ones whose interests are served by predictable conditions in which commerce and governance function normally. Some want transformation, an end to the old order and the establishment of something new in its place. These vary enormously in what specifically they want the new thing to be, which makes them difficult to treat as a single coherent force, but means that they collectively represent a significant pressure against any attempt to simply restore what was. And some simply want to win, to emerge from the chaos with more territory, more resources, more power than they went in with, without particular attachment to any ideological outcome. The Black Bears, as led by Mjordin, fall roughly into this category. Their goal is not the construction of a particular vision for Pywel. It is the accumulation of power and the elimination of anyone who might challenge that accumulation. Kliff moves through this landscape not as a disinterested observer, but as an active participant whose own project, the rebuilding of the Greymanes, necessarily intersects with the larger political situation. The Greymanes need land, support, clients and allies. All of those things exist in the political landscape of Pywel, and obtaining them means engaging with that landscape rather than standing aside from it. This engagement is gradual in the early chapters, but becomes more and more central as the story progresses. What begins as local problem solving, the Kylock situation, the wolf tracker tensions, the establishment of the Howling Hill base, gradually expands into something with continental implications, because the political conflict and the supernatural crisis of the Abyss are not two separate stories happening at the same time. They are the same story, told from two different angles. The instability of the Abyss, the fragments falling to Pywel's surface, the warping of the land where they land, the powers they grant to whoever collects them, is both caused by and contributing to the political instability on the surface. The comatose king and the power vacuum he created did not come from nowhere. The gathering of Abyss artifacts by factions like the Black Bears did not happen in isolation from the broader political situation. Everything is connected, and the more Kliff learns about both the surface politics and the Abyss above, the clearer that connection becomes. What is not yet clear, what remains, in this part of the story, still in the territory of discovered mystery rather than understood fact, is exactly what the connection is. Who or what is driving the imbalance in the Abyss, what the endgame is for the factions that are exploiting it, and what Jien, the former leader of the Greymanes, whose death preceded and in some sense precipitated everything that followed, actually was, and what responsibility his death has left unmet. Those questions are what the later chapters of the story will address. We are not there yet. For now, Kliff is in Hernand, building. The camp is small. The allies are few. The problems ahead are large. But the work has begun. And the Greymanes, however scattered, however diminished, are still the Greymanes. Rest now. The story has more ground to cover. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow and your body settle. We have established Hernand as Kliff's base of operations, understood the companions who will join his journey, and begun to understand the shape of the political crisis that makes Pywel such a volatile place to be operating in. Now the story expands. The Greymanes cannot rebuild by staying in one place. The scattered comrades are not all in Hernand. The threats that must be confronted are not all local. And the continent itself, its regions, its peoples, its deep history, is waiting to be explored and understood. In this part, we move across Pywel. We follow Kliff and his companions through the 5 major regions of the continent, understanding what each one is and what it contributes to the larger story. We encounter the bosses and adversaries that define each region, and we begin to see how the local stories of each region connect to the larger arc, that is pulling everything toward a confrontation that none of the individual regional conflicts could have produced alone. Hernand is the first region and the most familiar, having served as the setting for the story's opening chapters. It is a region of rich mountains and rivers, the kind of landscape that produces both agricultural wealth and strategic importance, because rivers are roads and mountains are defenses. The city of Hernand itself sits at a natural convergence of both, which explains why it has the density and the commercial activity that make it useful as a base. Hernand's political situation, as we've established, is complicated by the presence of House Celeste, the Goldleaf Merchant Guild, and the various rogue factions that operate in the spaces between them. But it is also complicated by something more immediate: the sky boulders. The fragments of the abyss falling to Pywel's surface land somewhere, and some of them land in and around Hernand. These landings are not subtle events. They warp the land around the impact point, creating zones of altered reality where normal rules of physics and ecology apply imprecisely or not at all. They attract people, the ambitious, the desperate, the curious, and the predatory, in ways that complicate an already complicated regional situation. Bon Midler, the man responsible for keeping order in Hernand, is one of the first local officials Kliff works with after his arrival. He sets Kliff on the trail of the Red Smoke Brigands, a group that has followed a sky boulder into the region and is exploiting the chaos it created. This is Kliff's first direct engagement with the Abyss's physical impact on Pywel, and it establishes a pattern that will repeat across every region he visits. The Abyss fragments arrive, they disrupt, they attract dangerous elements, and addressing those dangerous elements requires understanding the fragments themselves. Beyond Hernand lies Quiden, the cold mountain territory to the north, the region that the continent's old descriptions call the Land of the Wolf. Quiden is inhospitable in the specific way that high-altitude, cold-climate terrain tends to be. The landscape itself is an adversary. The communities that have built lives there are adapted to conditions that most outsiders find difficult, and the creatures that inhabit the wilder parts of the mountains are not the kind of wildlife that can be simply avoided. In Quiden, the Greymanes are seeking allies and resources. The treacherous terrain serves as a natural filter. The people who live successfully in Quiden have demonstrated by that fact alone a degree of hardiness and capability that makes them worth having as allies if they can be persuaded. And they are the kind of people who respect demonstrated capability above most other forms of persuasion. Kliff's arrival in Quiden has to be handled differently from his arrival in Hernand. The political currency is different, the social expectations are different, and the specific dangers are different. One of the most significant encounters in the Quiden sections involves a creature known as Sigurd the Staglord. The Staglord is not simply a large animal, though the name suggests something in that direction. It is a creature of enormous power, with a specific history embedded in the knowledge entries of the game's lore system. Imprisoned by forces connected to the kingdom of Demeniss, held in a state of captivity that drove it to a particular kind of rage, and then freed under circumstances that made its anger a problem for everyone in the region. The confrontation with the Staglord is one of the game's major boss encounters, and defeating it unlocks knowledge about Quiden's history and ecology that illuminates the region's relationship to the larger story. Demeniss is the region that the broader political crisis calls home. It is the largest and most politically significant region on the continent, the seat of the kingdom, whose comatose king created the power vacuum that everything else is trying to fill. Demeniss is where the old institutions of Pywel are most visible and most strained. The noble houses, the military apparatus, the commercial infrastructure, the religious organizations, all of them exist in Demeniss in their most developed form, and all of them are under pressure. This is where Damien comes from. Her history in Demeniss, her family's destruction, her training under the Swordmaster who took her in, her flight to Hernand, is embedded in the specific political landscape of this region. The forces that destroyed her family are part of the same forces that are now competing for the power left vacant by the king's absence. Kliff's engagement with Demeniss is therefore not simply a strategic matter of finding allies and resources. It is personal for Damien in ways that create additional complexity, additional stakes, additional dimensions to decisions that might otherwise seem purely tactical. The coast of Demeniss is home to smuggling networks that operate along the maritime routes. These are organizations that have developed in the spaces between formal governance and commercial legitimacy. Rings of operators who move goods that official channels cannot or will not handle, who have their own relationships with the noble houses and the merchant guilds that are sometimes collaborative and sometimes adversarial. Kliff encounters these networks and must decide how to relate to them, whether to shut them down, which would make him friends in some quarters and enemies in others, or to negotiate an arrangement that gives the Greymanes access to what the networks can provide. This kind of decision is characteristic of Crimson Desert's approach to its world. The game does not offer clean moral choices between obvious good and obvious evil. It offers situations where multiple reasonable positions exist, where the consequences of each choice extend beyond the immediate, and where the specific circumstances of Kliff's project, the rebuilding of the Greymanes, shape what is practical rather than simply what is ideal. Delecia is the region that the game's descriptions associate with forests, and the kind of ancient, deep-rooted ecology that tends to produce its own power structures independent of the ones built by human institutions. Pororin Forest is here, the forest that the game's lore associates with guardians and bells, with the Toll of Pywel questline that involves finding and ringing 8 bells distributed across the continent, with a community that has maintained its relationship to the land across spans of time that make the kingdoms of Pywel look recent. Delecia is also where some of the most interesting environmental storytelling in the game accumulates. The forests have their own history, not the political history of kingdoms and mercenary companies, but the longer, slower history of things that have been alive for a very long time and have accumulated a relationship with the land that human civilization has not. The creatures of Delecia are not simply obstacles. They are part of an ecology that predates the current political situation and will persist after it resolves, one way or another. Tashkalp is the desert region, the barren landscape that gives the game its name, the Crimson Desert itself. This is the most inhospitable territory on Pywel, and it is also the region where the game's title becomes literally relevant. The desert is not simply a biome. It is a place with specific history, specific significance, specific things buried in its sands that explain why the name Crimson Desert is the name of the whole game, rather than just the name of one region. The original concept for the game's story, the version that was planned before the development turmoil that reshaped the final product, centered more directly on the Crimson Desert itself, the specific resource that could only be extracted from the desert's unique geology, the political competition for control of that resource, the way that controlling the Crimson Desert meant controlling a form of economic power that translated directly into political power across the whole continent. Elements of this original concept are visible in the final game, though they are less central to the main narrative than they were originally intended to be. What the Crimson Desert represents in the final product is something broader. The extreme of Pywel's environments, the place where the world is most stripped down to its essentials, where the difficulty of simple survival makes everything else, politics, faction loyalty, personal history, temporarily irrelevant. Kliff and the Greymanes in the desert are operating at the limit of what they can sustain, and at that limit, things become clear in ways that the relative comfort of other regions obscures. Pailune, the Greymanes' original homeland, is present as a region that Kliff must eventually return to. It is not the first destination. In the early and middle chapters, returning to Pailune is not possible or not practical. The Black Bears hold it. The region is in chaos, and Kliff does not yet have the strength to do anything about that. But it is always present in the story's background. It is the place that was taken, the thing that must be recovered, the goal that gives all the other goals their ultimate shape. The architecture of Crimson Desert's story is in some ways the architecture of a return. Everything Kliff does, the allies he builds, the enemies he defeats, the resources he accumulates, the relationships he establishes across the regions of Pywel, is building toward the eventual reclamation of what was taken, not simply because Pailune is a piece of land, but because what Pailune represents, the possibility of a home, of permanence, of something built that can be kept, is what the Greymanes are ultimately fighting for. The bosses that Kliff encounters across these regions are not simply obstacles. They are expressions of what is wrong with Pywel, each one a specific manifestation of the continent's dysfunction. Kylock the Hornsplitter, who took over the Goldleaf Guild by force, represents what happens to commercial institutions when violence is applied without consequence. The Reed Devil, lurking in the wetland territories, represents the way that neglected environments produce threats that organized civilization has to deal with eventually. Kerush the Slayer, the imprisoned gorilla-like creature in Delicia, represents the consequences of using power to contain things that eventually cannot be contained. Cassius Morton, positioned deeper in the story's progression, represents the specifically human capacity for betrayal, for using relationships as weapons. Each confrontation adds something to the picture of Pywel as a place, not just to Kliff's power level, or to the resources available to the Greymanes, but to the understanding of what this continent is, and why it is in the state it is in. The knowledge entries unlocked by these encounters fill in history that the main narrative only gestures toward. The specific events that produce the current situations, the people whose choices created the problems that now need to be solved. What emerges across all 5 regions and the abyss above them is a picture of a continent that has been building toward a crisis for a long time. The Comatose King is the proximate cause of the power vacuum, but the conditions that made the power vacuum so destabilizing, the accumulated tensions between factions, the exploitation of abyss fragments by those seeking advantage, the failure of existing institutions to maintain the kind of justice that would have prevented the most ambitious actors from reaching the positions they now occupy. Those conditions predate the King's coma, and underneath all of it, always, the abyss, growing more unstable, sending more fragments to the surface, feeding the power of the factions that are exploiting it, while simultaneously making the situation worse for everyone, and calling toward its own resolution in ways that the people of Pywel are only beginning to understand. Sleep well. The continent is vast. We have not yet reached its deepest mysteries. Welcome back. Settle in. This part of the story moves into territory that the surface politics of Pywel only hint at. the older, stranger layer of the world that exists underneath the kingdoms and the mercenary companies and the power struggles we have been following. The Witches of Pywel are not a faction in the way that House Celeste or the Goldleaf Merchant Guild are factions. They do not hold territory. They do not have armies. They do not appear in the formal political negotiations between powers. They exist in the margins, in forests and caves and hidden locations that most people either do not know about or have learned to avoid. But they understand the abyss in ways that almost no one else in Pywel does. And in a world where the abyss is increasingly the central fact of the crisis that everyone is trying to navigate, that understanding is a form of power that cannot be dismissed. There are 5 witches in Pywel who will play a role in Kliff's journey, plus a hidden 6th figure who is connected to all of them, the one who goes by the name of the White Crow. The witches do not announce themselves. They are not the kind of people who seek out contact. Instead, they have made themselves nearly invisible, hiding in plain sight, disguised as ordinary people in ordinary situations, revealing their true nature only to those who demonstrate, through specific acts, that they are the kind of person worth revealing to. Each witch that Kliff encounters is found through a version of the same pattern. She is concealed as someone in need, someone in a difficult situation, someone whose distress is visible and whose specific circumstances invite a response of simple human decency. Lighting a fire for a woman shivering in the cold in Pailune's mountains, rescuing a woman who appears to be in danger in the witchwoods of Hernand, following up on a person who seems to be asking for help near a bridge in Demeniss. These are not grand quests. They are the kind of small, unremarkable acts of kindness that the world of Pywel, full of violence and ambition and institutional cruelty, does not particularly incentivize. The witches test for this quality deliberately. They have been alive long enough to know that power, given to the wrong person, is a catastrophic gift. The specific kind of power they possess, the ability to work with abyss gears, to embed and extract and craft with the fragments of the abyss itself, requires a certain relationship to the abyss to use responsibly. Not everyone who wants access to abyss power has that relationship. The witches are gatekeepers, in a quiet way, for something that should not be generally available. Eowyn, the Witch of Wisdom, is the first of them that Kliff encounters in a way that is directly tied to the main narrative. She is discovered during Chapter 5, the chapter that also involves Kerush the Slayer, the imprisoned creature of the Delicia forests. And her discovery is part of what makes that chapter a turning point in the story's development. Eowyn is described as an advanced witch, meaning her capabilities go beyond the basics that the other witches offer. She can not only embed and extract abyss gears, but craft them from raw materials, creating new combinations that expand what is possible in ways that simpler approaches to the abyss's fragments do not allow. Her knowledge of the sanctums, the ancient ruins that have been overtaken by hostile forces across Pywel, is deeper than any of the other witches, and her habit of visiting each sanctum after it is cleansed, sharing lore about its history and its connection to the forces that corrupted it, makes her one of the most reliable sources of information about what is actually happening in the abyss and why. Bari, the Witch of Kindness, is found in Pailune, in the northern reaches of Kliff's original homeland, near the Silverwolf mountains that mark the boundary between the inhabited parts of the region and the wilder territories beyond. The encounter with Bari requires warmth, literally and figuratively. Lighting a fire for a woman apparently suffering from the cold, offering something for nothing with no expectation of return. She is, in some sense, a test of whether Kliff has retained his fundamental character through everything that has happened to him. The mercenary world is not kind. It is efficient, it is practical. It rewards capability and reliability above almost everything else. But it can also strip away other qualities. The willingness to help without calculation. The recognition of another person's distress as something worth responding to. That the witches consider essential. Lycelia is found in the Demeniss region, hidden in a cave in the Serpent Marsh, between two mountains near an abyss nexus. Her discovery also requires an act of immediate help. Someone in danger on a bridge nearby. An intervention that leads to the cave and to Lycelia's location. She represents, in the witch taxonomy, a kind of wisdom oriented towards specific environments and their particular dangers. Arexiel, the Witch of Strength, is the most remote and most difficult to find. Located in the far eastern reaches of Pywel, near a landmark called the World's Navel, in territory that requires significant progression through the main story before it becomes accessible. Her discovery requires giving money to a beggar near a post house in the Tashkalp territory. Another act of simple generosity in a world that does not automatically reward it. And then there is Sylvia, the hermit witch, whose connection to the others comes not through a direct encounter in Pywel's landscape, but through a letter delivered by a bird, a white crow specifically. Sylvia is the most basic of the witches in terms of her specific capabilities. She offers the foundations of abyss gear work, without the advanced crafting and trading that Alolan provides. But she is often the first witch Kliff can access, and her role as an early guide to what abyss gears are and what they can do is essential for anyone beginning to understand the system. The white crow that delivers Sylvia's letter is not, it turns out, simply a bird. The white crow is the sixth figure, the hidden one, the one who exists behind the other five witches and appears, in retrospect, to have been orchestrating access to them from the beginning. The white crow as a bird, the actual animal that delivers letters, that appears at specific moments throughout Kliff's journey, is the white crow's presence manifesting in the physical world. She is watching. She has been watching all along. To reach the white crow in her true form, Kliff must earn the trust of all four of the token-granting witches, Elowen, Bari, Lycelia, and Arexiel. Each of them, after their sanctums have been cleansed, gives a witch's token. All four tokens, assembled, open the door of the hidden Wayward Woods witch hideout, deep in the foggy forests on the western side of Pailune, a place that is technically within the region of Kliff's homeland, but that the homeland's ordinary inhabitants do not know about or do not approach. Inside the hideout, the white crow waits. She is the guardian of the abyss, or of something connected to it. The abyss itself, in the game's description, has a cradle of providence that she watches over. The exact nature of what this means becomes clearer the further into the story's late chapters you go. But the encounter with the white crow represents the point at which Kliff's relationship to the abyss shifts from reactive to something approaching comprehensive understanding. He is no longer simply a person who went to the abyss by accident and came back with powers. He is, in some sense, being recognized as someone with a specific role. The sanctums that the witches send Kliff to cleanse are ancient ruins scattered across Pywel's regions, structures that predate the current kingdoms, that were built for purposes connected to the abyss and its relationship to the physical world, that have been corrupted and taken over by forces called the Antumbra. The Antumbra are not a faction in the conventional sense. They are worshippers, zealots in the game's description, connected to the dark side of the abyss. Their doctrine as Aloan explains when she visits each cleansed sanctum, involves what might be called atonement through suffering, a theology built around the idea that the abyss's power is accessed through pain, that the boundary between the physical world and the abyss can be pushed through destruction, that the falling fragments and the warping of the land are not problems to be addressed, but sacred events to be accelerated. This theology makes the Antumbra genuinely dangerous in ways that go beyond their immediate capacity for violence. They are not simply bandits or power-hungry opportunists. They are people acting on belief, and belief, in the world of Pywel as in any world, can motivate people to do things that pure self-interest would not justify. An Antumbra worshipper guarding a sanctum is not there because it is tactically advantageous. They are there because they believe, genuinely, that what they are doing is right. The specific bosses that guard the most significant sanctums, Antumbra's sword, Antumbra's staff, Antumbra's spear, are individuals who have risen to positions of authority within this organization, whose capabilities reflect what prolonged engagement with the dark side of the abyss does to a person who embraces rather than resists its influence. They are not simply powerful enemies. They are cautionary tales about what the abyss can do when it is worked with from the wrong orientation. This is one of the most interesting things that the Sanctum system in Crimson Desert does for the game's lore. The abyss itself is neutral. The White Crow's description of it emphasizes that its power is not inherently evil or good, that it is the use of it that determines what it produces. The witches represent one relationship to the abyss, respectful, careful, oriented toward balance. The Antumbra represent the opposite, extractive, destructive, oriented toward power at any cost. And the sanctums are the literal terrain where these two approaches have met and struggled, with the Antumbra's corruption sitting on top of what were originally structures built by people who understood the abyss the way the witches understand it. Cleansing the sanctums is therefore not simply a gameplay activity. It is a restoration, an undoing of something that should not have been allowed to happen, a rebalancing of specific locations in the physical world that have been pulled toward the dark side of the abyss and need to be pulled back. Each cleansed sanctum is a small piece of what the whole story is working toward, the restoration of balance between Pywel and the abyss above it. The puzzles that each sanctum contains are, in their own way, reflections of this theme. They involve understanding the abyss's mechanics, how the energy of the fragments flows, how the structure's built to work with that energy function, what needs to be connected or activated or repositioned to restore proper function. Kliff's growing command of his abyss-derived abilities, the Force Palm, the Axiom Force, the gliding, is what allows him to engage with these puzzles at all. The same abilities that make him more effective in combat are the abilities that make him able to understand and interact with the abyss's infrastructure. The Crowcaller is one of the significant adversaries encountered in the middle chapters, a boss tied to a faction called the Black Crows, whose operations in the region around Hernand Castle represent another expression of the theme of abyss power being exploited by those with malicious intent. The Black Crows are not the Antumbra. They are a different kind of actor, more conventionally motivated by power and advantage, but using abyss-related capabilities in their operations. The confrontation with Crowcaller, which happens twice, once as an initial encounter and once as a more fully developed boss fight, reflects the way that the game uses recurring adversaries to track the escalation of threats as Kliff grows stronger. The Hexamarie, the Black Witch encountered in Demeniss in the later chapters, represents a different kind of supernatural threat, one with its own specific history and motivation embedded in the lore of the region. her connection to dark magic, her use of crows as weapons and symbols, and her appearance as a major obstacle in Chapter 9, all suggest a figure who has her own relationship to the Abyss's powers, distinct from the witches who help Kliff, and distinct from the Antumbra who corrupt the Sanctums. By the time Kliff has moved through the Sanctum questlines and encountered the major supernatural threats of Pywel's middle chapters, the picture of what the Abyss is and what is happening to it has become considerably clearer. The fragments falling to the surface are symptoms of a growing imbalance. The Antumbra are accelerating that imbalance deliberately, and the dark forces seeking to open a permanent gate to the Abyss, mentioned as the game's larger threat, are working towards something that would make the current situation, bad as it is, look like a preliminary. The gate they want to open would collapse the barrier between the Abyss and the physical world entirely. Not the careful, controlled passage through specific nexus points that allows Kliff and others to move between the two realms. A permanent, total collapse. One that would change Pywel irrevocably, flooding the physical world with Abyss energy in ways that would make the current fragment impacts look minor. Who is behind this plan, and exactly how far they have gotten in pursuing it, is what the later chapters of the story reveal. Sleep well. The darkness above Pywel is deeper than it appears. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. This part of the story is the one that everything before it was building toward. Not the resolution, that comes later, but the turning point. The moment when the Greymanes stop being refugees and become something capable of taking the fight to the people who took everything from them. This is the homecoming. Chapter 7. The longest chapter in the game, with 19 quests spread across 4 distinct story arcs, spanning both the Pailune region and Demeniss, in a structure that reflects the dual nature of what Kliff is trying to accomplish. The personal mission and the political one, running alongside each other, each requiring attention, even when the urgency of the other seems to demand everything. But before Chapter 7, there are 6 other chapters worth understanding, because they are the architecture that makes the homecoming possible. Chapters 1 through 6 cover the period of Kliff's arrival in Hernand and the gradual, difficult work of rebuilding. Chapter 1, the first encounter, is the beginning. The chimney cleaning, the help extended to strangers, the slow accumulation of trust that eventually leads to the relationship with Shakatu and the Goldleaf Guild. It is not a dramatic chapter. It is a chapter about the tedious, necessary work that comes before anything dramatic can happen. Chapter 2, Golden Greed, extends Kliff's engagement with the economic and political structures of Hernand. The Goldleaf Guild situation with Kalok the Hornsplitter, the Unicorn Cliffs where that confrontation is resolved, the establishment of a reputation that goes beyond simply surviving one encounter and extends into something that the region's power structures can acknowledge and work with. Chapter 3, Howling Hill, is where the Greymane camp is formally established, where Kliff is granted land through the relationship with Marquis Circus, where the camp becomes a physical reality rather than an aspiration, and where Damien is unlocked as a companion and playable character. The camp at Howling Hill is not Pailune. It is not home, but it is something. It is a place that the Greymanes can call theirs, that they can defend, that they can use as a base for everything that follows. Chapter 4, The Price of Knowledge, is about the cost of the information Kliff needs. Understanding what happened to the Greymanes, not just the immediate facts of the attack on Pailune, but the deeper context, the reasons why Muradin moved when he did and in the way he did, the political forces that may have enabled or supported him. requires engaging with people and situations that come at a price. Not always a financial price, sometimes a moral one. The name of the chapter is precise. Chapter 5, Guest Unbidden, is the chapter of the witches and the supernatural. Elowin's discovery, the first encounter with the Sanctums and the Antumbra, the confrontation with Kerish the Slayer and what its defeat reveals about the history of the continent, and the Crow Caller, the figure connected to the Black Crows, who represents the extension of Abyss exploitation into Hernand's political situation in ways that make it impossible to treat the supernatural and the political as separate problems. Chapter 6, Cracks in the Shield, is the last chapter before the homecoming, and its name reflects what it depicts. The careful work of the previous chapters has created something, but that something is under pressure. The alliances Kliff has built are not perfect. The relationships he has cultivated are not without their complications and their competing interests. The chapter exposes the stress points in what has been constructed, creating the particular kind of tension that comes before a decisive moment. The sense that things must move forward, that the current equilibrium cannot be maintained indefinitely, that the homecoming can no longer be deferred. And then Chapter 7 begins. Pailune in winter is a different place from Pailune as the Greymanes remember it. The region is cold, genuinely hostile in the specific way that northern highland terrain in winter tends to be hostile, where the cold itself is an adversary that compounds every other difficulty. The Black Bears have been there since the night of the ambush, and what they have done with the time and the territory reflects what Mirrodin's organization actually is. Not simply a rival mercenary company, but a military force capable of establishing and maintaining control over a complex region. The Greymanes are not returning as refugees hoping to reclaim something. They are returning as an organized force, backed by allies they have spent 6 chapters building relationships with, capable of the kind of coordinated military action that the reclamation of Pailune requires. The Blue Fangs, a resistance movement that has been operating within Pailune since the Black Bears' occupation began, are among the forces that Kliff connects with in the region. They know the terrain. They know where the Black Bears are weakest. They have been waiting for exactly the kind of external force that the rebuilt Greymanes represent. The campaign unfolds in stages, each one a chapter in its own right within the larger chapter. Dawn Mist is the initial phase, positioning, securing safe houses, establishing the foothold from which the larger push can be launched. It is patient work, the kind of careful preparation that distinguishes a campaign from a charge. The Greymanes have learned this in their long months away from home. The impulse to simply attack, to move directly toward the goal, is real and urgent. The discipline to resist that impulse and do the necessary preparation first is what makes the attack, when it comes, survivable. Dawnrise is where the operation begins to move in earnest. The infiltration missions, the planted explosives, the coordination between Kliff's forces and the Blue Fang's resistance that turns a scattered series of individual actions into a coherent assault. The liberation of Pailune itself is a large-scale combat sequence, the kind of fight that involves not just Kliff, but his companions and their Greymane allies working together across a contested area. It is the game's clearest depiction of what the Greymanes are at their best. Not a single exceptional individual, but a community of fighters who know each other and work together in ways that individual excellence cannot replicate. The decisive battle subchapter is the climax of the Pailune campaign and one of the most significant sequences in the entire game. It culminates in the battle at Silverwolf Mountain, the confrontation that the whole story has been building toward, the rematch that the prologue established as necessary and that the intervening chapters made possible. Kliff climbs Silverwolf Mountain. He regathers with Nera, Jan, Dwayne, Unka, and Shane in sequence. A journey up the battlefield that is structured as a series of reunions, each one brief, each one charged with the accumulated weight of everything that has happened since the night they were scattered. These are the people who survived. These are the Greymanes who held on. Seeing them, fighting alongside them toward the summit, is the emotional preparation for what waits at the top. Maerdin is at Ashclaw Keep. The first time Kliff faced Maerdin, he could not win. The prologue scripted a defeat. Kliff fought, damaged Maerdin, and was ultimately taken apart, thrown into a river, left for dead. That encounter was designed to establish Maerdin as a genuine threat, a person whose victory over Kliff at his peak meant something. The rematch in Chapter 7 is the game asking whether the person who went into the abyss and came back has become enough to make the outcome different. The answer is yes, but not easily. Maerdin fights in two phases. The first phase is the version of him that Kliff has been building toward confronting. A powerful, technically skilled warrior whose 3-hit horizontal sweep and bare volley attacks represent the peak of what conventional fighting capability looks like. He is formidable. He is exactly the opponent the prologue established him as. And the first phase requires everything that Kliff has learned. The timing, the reading of attacks, the management of stamina, and positioning that the game has been developing across its preceding chapters. The second phase is something else. Maerdin, in his second phase, transforms, incorporating lava-based attacks that change the fundamental character of the fight. The arena itself becomes a factor in ways it was not before, with lava at the edges that represents an instant kill for anyone knocked into it. This is Maerdin drawing on something beyond his own natural capability, on the abyss power that the Black Bears have been accumulating through their collection and exploitation of abyss artifacts. It is, in a sense, the abyss turned against the person who was sent back from the abyss to fix what is wrong with it. Kliff defeats him. The sword earned from this battle is named Melted Ambition, a name that carries the weight of what the confrontation was about. Ambition, Maerdin's specifically, and its cost. The aftermath is not a moment of uncomplicated triumph. Kliff is severely injured in the fight. Unka takes command of the immediate situation. And this is the moment where Unka becomes fully playable for the first time. The transition from Kliff to Unka in the game structure reflects the transition in the story. The decisive battle has been fought, but the campaign is not over, and the person who fought it cannot immediately continue. Unka steps forward, and the Twisted Fate arc plays out through him. Following up on Ludwig, the second major antagonist of the Pailune campaign, dealing with the Jackals who are operating independently of the defeated Black Bears. Ludwig is a skilled warrior, a two-phase boss with teleportation and lightning-based attacks that make him a different kind of challenge from Maerdin. He represents the secondary layer of the Black Bear's command structure, the question of what happens to a military organization when its leader is defeated but its forces remain. The confrontation with Ludwig, played entirely as Unka, is both a practical conclusion to the Pailune campaign and a demonstration of what Unka is capable of when the story's primary protagonist is not available to carry the weight. The liberation of Pailune is complete. The homeland has been reclaimed. The Greymane camp can, in the game's endgame, be relocated from Howling Hill back to Pailune itself. A symbolic restoration that the game marks with the proud returnee achievement, acknowledging what it means to go home. but Chapter 8 is called Blood Coronation, and it points toward what Chapter 7's victory has not resolved. The Black Bears were not the only thing wrong with Pywel. Muradin's defeat does not end the political crisis created by the King's coma. The Antumbra and their project of opening a permanent gate to the Abyss has not been addressed by the campaign in Pailune. The larger forces, the ones that Kliff has been gathering information about since the Abyss first showed him that his personal mission existed within something much larger, are still in motion. The homecoming is real. The reclamation of Pailune is real. These things matter, and they are not diminished by the knowledge that they are not the end. But they are also clearly not the end. The story that began with the destruction of the Greymanes has expanded, through the process of the Greymanes rebuilding, into something that the Greymanes alone cannot resolve. Kliff has come home, and now he has to save everything else. In the next part, we follow the story into its final chapters, into the Blood Coronation and what it represents, into the final confrontation with the dark forces seeking to collapse the barrier between Pywel and the Abyss, and into the question of what it costs a person to carry the kind of responsibility that Kliff has inherited from Jian. Sleep well. The hardest part is still ahead. Welcome back. Let the quiet settle around you. The Greymanes have come home. Pailune has been reclaimed. Mercenaries has been defeated. These are real achievements, permanent changes in the situation that cannot be taken back. But Chapter 8, Blood Coronation, carries a name that signals immediately that what has been accomplished is not the end of the story. A coronation is a beginning, and blood suggests that the beginning in question is not a comfortable one. The chapter takes Kliff and his companions back to Demeniss, back to the largest and most politically significant region on Pywel, back to the kingdom whose comatose king created the power vacuum that everything else has been playing out within. But the political crisis of the succession is not simply abstract anymore. The specific figures competing for power, the specific events that have shaped the current situation, are becoming visible in ways that earlier chapters only gestured toward. The Visione helmet is one of the most interesting tools in Crimson Desert's story arsenal, and Chapter 8 uses it more extensively than any earlier chapter. It is a device, part of the ancient technology that the Abyss's presence on Pywel has made accessible, that allows its user to read memory fragments embedded in physical locations. Where significant events have occurred, where strong enough emotion or consequence has been concentrated, traces remain. The Visione helmet can access those traces, allowing the viewer to experience the memory as though present within it. The investigation of Duke Caliburn's old office in the Demeniss capital palace is the chapter's central scene, and the quest that gives the entire chapter its name. Kliff uses the Visione helmet to access a memory embedded in the office, a memory of a historic slaughter, a moment of betrayal that the chapter title calls the Blood Coronation. What that memory reveals about the history of Demeniss, about the specific events that led to the current political situation, and about the specific individuals involved, Gabriel Caliburn among them, recontextualizes much of what has been happening in the political landscape throughout the game. The Blood Coronation, as an event, was a betrayal that happened at a moment of apparent celebration. Someone using the formality and ritual of a significant political moment as cover for an act of violence that changed the direction of Demeniss's history. The specific details of that betrayal, and the specific people who perpetrated it and who suffered from it, are embedded in the memory that Kliff reads, and understanding it changes his understanding of the situation he has been operating within. The confrontation with Gabriel Caliburn that follows the memory is a scripted loss, like Kliff's first encounter with Mjerdin. In the prologue, it is designed to establish something important rather than to provide a conventional boss fight. Gabriel Caliburn is not a person that Kliff, at this point in the story, can simply overpower. The encounter is about understanding, not about winning, about recognizing the nature and scale of what Kliff is dealing with in the political landscape of Demeniss. Control shifts to Damien after this encounter, a narrative choice that reflects both the practical reality of Kliff's situation and the thematic significance of who Damien is in this context. Demeniss is where she comes from. The specific kind of corruption and betrayal that the blood coronation represents is something she has a more personal relationship to than Kliff does. Her history, her family's destruction, the erasure of their records, the particular kind of institutional violence that powerful people use to eliminate problems without visible accountability, connects directly to the kind of thing the blood coronation memory has just revealed. The traitor arc at the end of Chapter 8 delivers a story revelation that the game's documentation describes as setting up the endgame, without spoiling every specific detail, some of which the game has not yet made fully accessible in easily documentable form, given how recently it released. The revelation involves the specific connections between the political crisis on Pywel's surface and the supernatural crisis of the Abyss. The forces working to open a permanent gate to the Abyss are not separate from the political forces seeking to exploit the power vacuum created by the King's coma. They are the same forces, or at least deeply intertwined with them. This is the synthesis that the story has been building toward since the moment Kliff woke up in the Abyss and began to understand that his personal mission existed within something larger. The personal, the political, and the supernatural are all expressions of the same underlying problem. A problem that has a specific source, specific agents, and a specific shape that Chapter 8 begins to make fully visible. The chapters that follow, 9 through 12, plus the epilogue, represent the endgame of the story, the final push toward the resolution of everything that has been building. Chapter 9, The Sage of the Desert, takes the action into the Crimson Desert itself, the eponymous region that has been present in the game's name throughout, but that has not been the primary setting until this late in the story. The desert, with its particular combination of extreme conditions and deep historical significance, is the appropriate setting for the revelations that come in this chapter. The Veiled Witch and the Black Witch questlines in Chapter 9 develop the supernatural dimension of the story further. Hexamarie, the witch boss encountered in Demeniss, represents a specific strand of dark magic that connects to the Abyss in ways that the other witches Kliff has encountered do not. Her connection to crows, the same birds that the White Crow uses as messengers, the same birds that appear throughout the game as markers of Abyss presence, suggests a history and a relationship to the Abyss's power that the story uses to deepen the picture of what the Abyss actually is and what kinds of entities have learned to work with it. Chapter 10, Counterattack, is where the Greymanes and their accumulated allies begin to move decisively against the forces that have been working toward the Abyss Gate. The previous chapters have been gathering intelligence, allies, resources, understanding. Chapter 10 is the application of all of that gathering toward a specific objective. The counterattack is exactly what the word suggests, a response, coordinated and deliberate, against the specific threat that the endgame has been building toward. Chapters 11 and 12, Reality and Truth and Abyss Creature, move into territory that the game's title gestures toward, but that the earlier chapters have been preparing. The Abyss creature of Chapter 12's title is the game's final boss, the culmination of what the dark forces seeking to open the permanent gate have been working toward, the specific entity or event that results from the collapse of the barrier between the physical world and the Abyss. The structure of these final chapters reflects the structure of the story as a whole. They are not simply action sequences, not simply a series of boss fights escalating in difficulty until the final encounter. They are story chapters in the full sense. Chapters that provide information, that complete character arcs, that bring the threads that have been accumulating since the prologue to their resolutions. 14. The Cursed Knight, encountered in Chapter 8's middle sections, is one of the significant adversaries of the endgame. He is a warrior marked by the specific kind of abyss corruption that the dark forces have been spreading. Someone whose capabilities reflect what happens when abyss power is used without the restraint and understanding that the witches represent. His defeat provides specific rewards, a name cloak, equipment tied to his story, but more importantly provides information that advances the investigation into what is actually happening at the supernatural level. The Crimson Nightmare, another boss in the final sections, represents something different from the human adversaries that have populated most of the game's boss roster. It is a manifestation of the Abyss's darker possibilities, the kind of entity that results from the imbalance growing to a critical degree, something that belongs to the category of the inhuman, rather than the category of the villainous. Confronting it requires understanding what it is in a way that confronting Myrddin or Kylock did not. The final battle and the Void, the last named story sections before the epilogue, are where everything comes together. The Void is not simply a location. It is what the collapse of the barrier between the physical world and the Abyss produces at its most extreme. A state of reality where the rules that govern normal experience no longer apply, where the specific capabilities that Kliff has developed through his time in the Abyss are the only things that allow him to function at all. The epilogue, Journey's End, is what the story lands on. It is not a triumphant moment in the conventional sense. The world of Pywel, after everything that has happened to it, is not a world that can simply return to what it was before. Too much has changed. Too many people are dead or scattered or transformed by what they went through. The political situation, even with the most immediate threats addressed, remains complicated in ways that will take a long time to resolve. But something has been preserved. The Greymanes exist again, as a community, as a home, as the specific kind of thing that Gian built, and that the Night of the Ambush destroyed, and that Kliff has spent the entire game rebuilding. Pailune can be reclaimed. The balance of the Abyss can be restored. The specific threat that drove the endgame can be stopped. The epilogue acknowledges all of this, the losses, the costs, the permanent changes, without pretending that the story's resolution is the same as a return to the beginning. Something was destroyed. Something was built in its place. The two things are not identical, and the story is honest about that. What it is also honest about is that what was built has value, that the Greymanes that exist at the end of the story, diminished in some ways, expanded in others, changed by everything they went through, are genuinely the Greymanes. That Kliff, who began the story as someone's son and ended it as something he chose to become, is exactly where he should be. The world of Pywel continues. The Abyss above it, restored to something approaching balance, continues to be what it is, a mystery, a source of power, a dimension that the inhabitants of the physical world below are only beginning to understand. The fragments that fell from it and the changes they made to the land will take time to fade. The political situation will require continued work from people willing to do it, but the immediate crisis is over. And in its resolution, something about what Pywel is has been clarified that could not have been clarified any other way. In the final part, we step back from the story's specific events and look at the world of Crimson Desert as a whole. What it is about, what Pearl Abyss built and why, and what this universe has to offer to the people who enter it, looking for exactly the kind of thing it provides. Sleep well. The worst is over. Welcome back. This is the last part. Take a moment with that. You have followed a long story. From the night the Greymanes were destroyed, through the Abyss and the Return, through 6 chapters of rebuilding and 5 regions of a continent discovering itself in crisis, through the Homecoming and the Blood Coronation and the final battles in the Void. You have seen Kliff MacDuff go from a man thrown into a river and left for dead to the person who restored balance between 2 worlds. This final part is different. We are not moving forward through new events. We are stepping back, the way you step back from something when you want to see its full shape, and looking at what Crimson Desert actually built. Because Pearl Abyss built something substantial here. Not perfect. The game has been honest about its development difficulties, about the story that was changed and redirected, and ultimately delivered under circumstances that left marks, but substantial nonetheless. A world that has real density, real texture, real history embedded in the landscape in ways that reward attention. And a story that, whatever its structural imperfections, is about something genuine. Pywel as a world was built with a specific approach that Pearl Abyss has been open about discussing. The inspiration from Sicily and other Mediterranean landscapes, studying historical architecture and natural environments to give the continent a grounded, lived-in quality. The commitment to designing a world that felt inhabited rather than simply constructed. The over 100 distinct factions, each with its own relationship to the territory around it, its own history, its own specific way of operating within and against the structures that other factions have built. This commitment produces something that the game's more critical reviewers have also noticed, though they have sometimes found it frustrating rather than impressive. The density of Pywel's world is not always matched by the density of its main narrative. Much of the most interesting lore is in the knowledge menu, in the entries unlocked through conversations, discoveries, and boss defeats that fill in context that the main story gestures toward without fully articulating. A player who moves through Crimson Desert without engaging with those entries will have a different experience of the story than a player who reads them carefully. The main narrative makes sense without them, but it makes much more sense with them. This is one of the things that makes Crimson Desert genuinely suited to the format of this video, to the kind of telling where every piece of available information is woven into a continuous narrative, where the distinction between what the main story shows you and what the knowledge menu tells you is dissolved into a single coherent account. The world of Pywel is rich enough to sustain that kind of treatment. The story rewards the patient approach. The Abyss is the element of Crimson Desert's world that distinguishes it most clearly from the conventional medieval fantasy that its surface aesthetics suggest. The continent of Pywel, on first encounter, looks like familiar territory. The kingdoms, the mercenaries, the noble houses and merchant guilds and religious organizations that form the apparatus of a feudal fantasy world. But the abyss above it, and the fragments falling from it, and the witches who understand it, and the Antumbra who worship it, and the specific mystery of what it is and why it is destabilizing. All of this adds a dimension that the surface aesthetics do not prepare you for. The Abyss in Crimson Desert is neither purely magical nor purely technological. It is something more specific, a parallel dimension with its own rules and its own history, connected to the physical world below in ways that the inhabitants of that world are only beginning to understand. The ancient technology that allows Kliff to interact with it is real technology, not mysticism. The effects it produces in the physical world, the fragment landings, the warping of the land, the enhanced capabilities it grants to people who work with its artifacts, are real effects with real causes. But the framework for understanding those causes is not available to most of the people experiencing the effects. This is one of the most consistent sources of conflict in Pywel's story. The Antumbra have developed a theology around the Abyss's effects, a framework that gives meaning to what they experience, but that fundamentally misinterprets it. The noble houses and merchant guilds that exploit Abyss artifacts for competitive advantage understand what those artifacts do, without understanding what they are or where they come from. The witches understand more than anyone else on the surface, but their knowledge is still partial. They know how to work with the Abyss responsibly, but the full history of what it is and what it was designed for is not available even to the White Crow. Only by going into the Abyss, as Kliff did involuntarily at the moment of his apparent death, can the full picture begin to emerge. The Wycliffe Mappery, the structures of the floating islands, the specific architecture of the places above Pywel that were built by hands not recorded in any surface history. These things point toward an origin and a purpose for the Abyss that the story has not yet fully articulated, but that the final chapters begin to approach. This is, in a sense, an invitation. Crimson Desert is a new world, built by a team that has been developing the Black Desert online franchise for over a decade and has accumulated an extraordinary amount of experience in building worlds that sustain long-term engagement. The story that Kliff's campaign tells is complete. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, a character arc that resolves, a world that is left in a different state than it was found in. But the world itself, Pywel and the Abyss above it, is clearly capable of supporting more stories than this one. The knowledge menu contains history that the main story does not tell. The 100+ factions have storylines that the main campaign only introduces. The 5 regions each have depth that the main quest explores selectively, leaving large portions of their potential unexplored. And the Abyss, its origin, its purpose, the full history of whatever civilization built the structures on its floating islands, is a mystery that the first game story illuminates without resolving. This is by design. Pearl Abyss has built a world that is explicitly larger than the story it is currently telling. Not in the way that a world-building exercise produces a document of imagined history that has no story to attach to, but in the way that a genuinely inhabited world is larger than any individual's experience of it. Pywel existed before Kliff's story began. It will continue after his story ends. The things that happened in it before the night of the Greymane's destruction are real history with real consequences. The things that will happen in it after the endgame resolution are real future with real possibilities. Kliff MacDuff is the protagonist of this particular story, but he is not the only person who matters in Pywel, and the world that he helped preserve, the world that the Greymanes, rebuilt and returned, have made their home in again, is a world that will continue to generate stories as long as anyone is paying attention to it. This is what a good world does. It persists. It exceeds the immediate story being told about it. It has the particular quality of places that are real, of seeming to continue existing when no one is looking at it, of having happened and continuing to happen in ways that the story can only partially capture. Pywel is that kind of world. Whether you came to it through the main campaign, through the faction quest lines, through the knowledge entries that fill in the history the main story gestures toward, through the experience of simply exploring a landscape that rewards the walking of it, Pywel offers something that the best game worlds offer. The sense that you have been somewhere real, that the time you spent there was spent in a place with genuine weight and genuine history, that leaving it does not mean it stopped existing. The Greymanes are home. The Abyss is in better balance than it was. The specific people who threaten Pywel in this chapter of its history have been addressed, and the world goes on, complicated, contested, marked by everything that happened to it and everything that happened in it, continuing to be what it is. This is where Kliff's story leaves us, not in a resolution that forecloses everything that comes after, but in a state, the Greymanes restored, Pailune reclaimed, the Abyss partially understood, the larger mystery still ahead. That is genuinely a new beginning, as much as it is an ending. The best stories do this. They arrive somewhere, and in arriving, they open more than they close. You understand more at the end than at the beginning, not just about the events of the story, but about the world that the story happened in. And the world, now understood more fully, is more interesting than it was when you entered it. That is Crimson Desert. That is Pywel. That is the story of Kliff Macduff and the Greymanes, told from the night of their destruction to the day of their return, and from the first fragment falling from the abyss to the moment when the balance between two worlds is restored. Good night. You started this in the dark. You are still in the dark. That is the nature of sleeping, which is what this is for. But somewhere above you, if you tilted your head and looked, you might imagine a continent of rolling hills and ancient forests, and cold northern mountains and hot southern deserts, and the cities of people doing what people always do. Trying to survive, trying to build something, trying to hold on to what they love. And above that, in the clouds or beyond them, floating islands that nobody on the surface fully understands yet, lit from within by something older than the kingdoms below, waiting patiently for whoever comes next. Sleep well. Pywel will be here when you wake.